No fame. Just a fortune.
At the start of the 18th century, England recognized the vast mercantile wealth her American colonies offered beyond gold and furs. So on March 26, 1701, England's Board of Trade advised the Crown to change all of her chartered colonies of North America to royal colonies. England sought to create an empire of immigrants, ruled entirely from London. While the European powers of Spain and France explored the New World and established trading posts, built missions, and erected military facilities, their colonists were never true immigrants. They came to the New World with the idea of staying a few years, making a fortune, and then returning to Europe. The English, however, saw opportunities in the New World and traveled to North America to stay permanently. They were not only explorers, but also craftsmen and farmers. They hailed from the educated as well as the working class. But most of all, they brought their families with them, women and children who understood the benefits of creating a new life. In the 17th century, the English immigrants settled along the eastern seaboard from Massachusetts to South Carolina, partitioning this largely wooded land into colonies that were granted charters by England's kings. The first colony was Virginia in 1607. Settlers under Captain John Smith founded Jamestown, and for more than a decade, Virginia was the only safe landfall for English immigrants in the New World. Then in a period of 20 years, 4 more colonies followed as a great migration of people left England. In 1620, a group of Puritans founded a colony at Plymouth Rock, south of Boston. 10 years later, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was granted a charter by Charles I. In 1632, Lord Baltimore was given a proprietary charter for 10 million acres on Chesapeake Bay and named his colony Maryland. Founded in 1636, Rhode Island and Connecticut were granted royal charters in 1644 and 1663, respectively. In the second half of the 17th century, a second wave of immigrants came from England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and Northern Europe. Originally known as New Netherlands, New York was captured from the Dutch and rechristened in 1660. It became a royal colony in 1685. At the same time, New Jersey split from New York to become its own colony. In 1663, Carolina was founded. However, by 1729, 2 distinctive regions had formed, and North and South Carolina were carved out of the original grant. In 1679, colonists in western Massachusetts persuaded Charles II to make New Hampshire a separate royal colony. In 1681, William Penn established the colony of Pennsylvania as a holy experiment to create God's heaven on earth. Later, Penn bought land from the Duke of York, which would become the independent colony of Delaware in 1701. The last colony founded was Georgia in 1732. Thus, the North American colonies became established over a period of 125 years. Today, the world's longest suspension bridge spans the Straits of Mackinac. But over 300 years ago, these strategic narrows were the starting point of the French Inland Water Highway in North America. Linking Lake Michigan to the other Great Lakes and eventually the Atlantic Ocean, the Straits of Mackinac were also France's bridge to many important Native American tribes. While the British developed colonies on the Atlantic seacoast and Spain directed its attention to the south and west, the French focused on Canada. Jesuit missionaries and fur trappers called coureurs de bois pushed deep into the heart of the continent along the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. By the start of the 18th century, nearly 60,000 French had settled along these North American waterways. While the English and Spanish colonists pushed Native Americans off their land, the French respected the Indians, forming alliances whose consequences would be felt throughout the 18th century. In 1697, the French government revoked fur trapping licenses and abandoned its 17th century forts in the Great Lakes region. However, the French trading posts and settlements continued to thrive along the shores of the Great Lakes, serving as gathering places for fur traders. This frontier practice continued with the mountain men at their rendezvous in the Rocky Mountains 100 years later. However, the withdrawal of soldiers was short-lived. In 1701, France's government reversed its policy. Once again, troops were sent into the interior of North America to build military outposts and establish settlements in a 30-year project designed to encircle the British colonies. The first of these forts was at present-day Detroit. Others included Mobile Bay in Alabama, Cahokia and Kaskaskia on the Mississippi, Vincennes in present-day Indiana, and in 1715, French soldiers and fur traders built the wall community for Michelamac on the southern shores of the Strait of Mackinac. The French were now poised to defend their hold on North America. However, the French, unlike the British colonists, never looked to build a new nation. The colonists always saw themselves as an extension of old France and the monarchy. For the next 60 years, the French developed their colorful frontier lifestyle into the fateful and final conflict with the British, who removed them as a power in North America. However, the French influence can still be experienced in the 21st century in such places as Quebec, New Orleans, small towns along the Great Lakes, and in the reconstructed Fort Michelamac. By the beginning of the 18th century, the American colonies were consistently taking small steps which established procedures and practices that broke with traditions of Europe and the English in particular. When the College of Yale was founded in 1701 in Saybrook, Connecticut, for the first time an institution of higher learning was governed by a single board of trustees. Thus began the long march toward the American educational institutions of today, free of church and central government control. It would take over 2 centuries, but eventually America's institutions of higher learning would surpass any in the world. At the start of the 18th century, elementary education in the colonies was supervised by the parents, as it had been in England. But unlike England, colonial officials offered a higher education to all. American colleges would soon differ from their European counterparts in 3 ways. First, by promoting the importance of the college president. Second, by each college independently offering degrees to its students. And third, by an increasingly secular curriculum. As Ben Franklin wrote,
"The first drudgery of settling new colonies, which confines the attention of people to mere necessaries, is now pretty well over. And there are many in every province and circumstances that set them at ease and afford leisure to cultivate the finer arts and improve the common stock of knowledge."
But Franklin's observation expressed an even deeper desire in the emerging American psyche. By the middle of the 18th century, colonists endorsed the idea that education should not be kept from ordinary citizens, as it had been in Europe, but should be available to all. Many of America's revolutionary leaders could claim attendance in the higher institutions such as Yale, Harvard, and William and Mary, which were created in the early colonial period. Today, America's universities and colleges are the cornerstone of the nation's independent free mind and a source of innovation and a prepared workforce. On the Atlantic coast of present-day Florida is the oldest European city in the United States of America, St. Augustine. The Spanish founded St. Augustine in 1565, and at the same time built the massive fort Castillo dan San Marco, a structure which still exists today. At the end of the 17th century, Spain held Florida and Mexico, which included parts of present-day Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. France occupied eastern Canada and controlled the Mississippi River. England ruled a narrow strip of land along the Atlantic seaboard from New England to the Carolinas. The Atlantic Ocean separated North America from Europe, and it appeared as though nothing there could affect the New World. However, in 1701, Louis XIV of France placed his grandson on the Spanish throne, which to the English seems a threat to the balance of power in Europe. The war that resulted was called Queen Anne's War and quickly spread to North America. Queen Anne's War created an opportunity for the European powers to advance their positions in the New World. At that time, Spain blocked southern expansion by English colonists. So in 1702, a force of 500 Carolinians, accompanied by a small fleet, attacked St. Augustine. They sacked the town, but were unable to capture the massive Castillo de San Marco. As a result of the English attack and a dozen more like it along the Gulf Coast, Spain began strengthening its empire in the southwest by building a series of settlements and presidios in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, including in 1718 a mission in San Antonio that would later be called the Alamo. Eventually, Americans would covet this territory for themselves. The sacking of St. Augustine began a 200-year process of colonists and later Americans attacking and taking pieces of the Spanish Empire, justified by a policy christened in the 19th century as Manifest Destiny. St. Augustine was returned to the Spanish only to be ceded to the United States in 1819. With the dawn of the 18th century, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was in transition from a simple society whose survival was based in large part on strict religious doctrines, to a new kind of civilization, one of tolerance and freedom. The new land that would eventually become the United States of America was transforming the inhabitants as they broke from the ways and views of Old England. Cotton Mather was a pivotal figure in that transition. In 1702, Cotton Mather published his magnum opus, Magnalia Christi Americana, the great achievement of Christ in America. The book was a history of the first 50 years in New England, and marked the midpoint of the country's first major ideological transition. Its author, Cotton Mather, was like the country, a man in transition, and the first American to be recognized as a Renaissance man. Mather was born in 1663. Preceded by his father and grandfather in the ministry, he too became a clergyman. In the early years, he was a strict religious leader and even helped initiate the Salem witch trials. Later, he would condemn the killing of presumed witches. He embraced the principles of John Locke and Sir Isaac Newton, and saw scientific inquiry as a way of understanding God's creation. He helped form America's own version of Christianity. Like most Massachusetts colonists, he was a Puritan, but he drew upon the experience of living in the New World to shape an American version of Christianity that differed greatly from his Calvinist forebears and the Church of England. Mather's Puritan society advocated the simplicity of doing good and an ecclesiastical experience of God. Like the Renaissance men who would follow him, such as Jefferson and Franklin, Mather was interested in natural science and was an early advocate of the smallpox vaccination, which placed the pox virus under the skin. He wrote 450 books on a wide range of subjects. When Cotton Mather said that the Puritan tradition in England offers a nice illustration of how a man's mind begins to make its way, one pole of thought to another, he could just as well have been making a statement about himself. He was the first of the transitional figures that would shape the American mind and experience in the 18th century. Separation of church and state, religious tolerance, two principles that are fundamental building blocks of the U.S. Constitution. Principles that perhaps have been the most difficult to adhere to in America. Many of the American colonists immigrated to the New World to escape religious intolerance. The Puritans came to America to escape persecution by the Church of England. Maryland was founded as a safe haven for Catholics, and William Penn established Pennsylvania as a refuge for the Quakers. Oddly, once here, the colonists developed a position of religious intolerance to all faiths other than their own. One need only recall the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts to realize the perverse depths to which religious intolerance drove the early colonists. However, initially none were more despised than the Quakers. Known as the Society of Friends, the Quakers were the most individualistic of the Protestant sects that immigrated from England, hounded out of every colony from Massachusetts to Carolina. In New England, the Reverend John Wilson proclaimed that he would eagerly carry fire in one hand and wood in the other to burn all the Quakers in the world. What made the Quakers so despised was that they made Christianity a personal experience, eliminating all aspects of organized religion. All Quakers were lay preachers, and they gathered in Quaker meeting halls. So when a Quaker meeting hall was built in Puritan Boston in 1709, it marked a significant step towards religious tolerance, a religious tolerance the Quakers, disproportionate to their numbers, had a hand in developing. Besides the acceptance of all religions, the Quakers were pacifists, had strong humanitarian values, opposed slavery, promoted friendly relations with the Native Americans, and advocated self-discipline, virtues that would be shared by many Americans in the future. In 1682, the most famous colonial Quaker, William Penn, founded the Pennsylvania colony as a safe haven for Quakers, but unlike other colonies, Pennsylvania was open to all religions, preparing the way for a true American religious tolerance. When Queen Anne's War ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, little had changed in Europe. However, the 12-year-long conflict with Britain and France's ally Spain, introduced practices that set the stage for a geographical, societal, and governmental transformation of the North American continent. England, for the first time, landed troops in its North American colonies. Before that, colonists had been forced to deal with hostilities on their frontiers by themselves. At the outset of the war in 1701, a Boston merchant, Samuel Vetch, told Queen Anne that Her Majesty shall be sole empress of the vast North American continent, if she would provide aid to her colonies in their fight against the French in Canada and the Spanish in Florida. England responded with troops to attack French colonies in Canada. The second major impact was that all sides in the conflict used Native Americans in their war campaigns. This idea proved so advantageous that Britain and France would continue to employ Native American tribes in the War of Jenkins' Ear, the French and Indian War, and the War for Independence. Later, Britain would use its Indian allies in the War of 1812, and the United States would employ Indian scouts and warriors in the Mexican-American War in its wars against Native Americans throughout the 19th century. Third, the French and Spanish now saw England's American colonists as a threat independent of England itself. Consequently, Spain and France accelerated their efforts to encircle the English colonies with a network of forts and settlements along the Mississippi River, the Gulf Coast, and the Southwest. Oddly, the most far-reaching consequence was that Queen Anne's War strengthened each of the individual colonies' sense of independence. Some historians have theorized that the refusal of the colonies to aid each other during the war led to the establishment of a republic of states, rather than a homogeneous nation, when America first broke free from England. Finally, through the Treaty of Utrecht, England gained territory in North America. It received from France, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and part of the Hudson Bay area. The failure to set exact boundaries around Hudson Bay set up the next round of hostilities between the French and British and ended the New World's isolation from the happenings of Europe. The soul of the great American experiment may be principles embodied in the Constitution, but the engine that has always driven it has been economics. And in the 18th century, economics meant trade and shipping. As the 1700s dawned, the American colonies had already moved from a survival economy based solely on agriculture to one which strongly included commerce. Americans were engaged in trading throughout the world. They participated heavily in the highly profitable triangle trade. Saltfish, horses, and oxen shipped to the Caribbean and returned to New England as molasses, used in making rum. They shipped the rum to West Africa for slaves and transported the slaves to North and South America for more raw materials, which they carried to England, returning at last to the colonies with manufactured goods. The economic relationship between Britain and her colonies was largely one way. The colonies were expected to exploit the available raw materials and ship them to Britain so that her manufacturers could become rich selling finished goods to the colonists and the rest of the world. Eventually, this one-way street would become the major factor driving the American colonists to revolution. But rebellion may not have happened if the Americans had not begun the process of self-reliance. One defining step in this process was the designing, constructing, and launching of the first American schooner at Gloucester, Massachusetts in 1713 by Captain Andrew Robinson. Legend has it that a bystander to the launching said, "See how she scoons," meaning that the ship skipped across the waves like a stone. And the good captain replied, "Then the schooner let her be." Schooners are defined as vessels with two or more masts, with the main mast taller than the foremast. Robinson's schooner, faster than European commercial ships, could compete more economically with their British, French, and Dutch counterparts. This event began two courses that helped define the nation. Besides developing the northeast fisheries still active today, the schooner accelerated trade between the colonies up and down the coast. Thus began a process of constantly improving the interconnectedness of the nation, from national roads and turnpikes, to canals connecting the interior waterways, to covered wagon trains bringing the east and west together, to the railroad boom, and to the modern interstate highways of today. The second course, represented by the Robinson schooner, was a knack for Americans to produce inventions that would drive a new wave of economic development. In the 19th century, it started with Fulton's steamship and ended with Alexander Graham Bell's telephone and Thomas Edison's light bulb. It continues today with the software developed by entrepreneurs such as Microsoft's Bill Gates. In the late 17th century, French explorers and trappers recognized the Mississippi River, cutting through the heart of the North American continent, as the key to commerce west of the Appalachian Mountains. Following France's defeat by Britain in Queen Anne's War, the French government shifted its focus to controlling this vast waterway in order to prevent British colonists from expanding westward past the Appalachian Mountains. In 1713, while Britain's colonies had passed the 350,000 mark, France's North American colonists numbered less than 60,000. The least populated and the most vulnerable of the French colonies was Louisiana, named by the French explorer Robert La Salle for King Louis XIV. La Salle envisioned the interior of North America as the greatest agricultural and commercial empire in the world. To secure this empire and stem the British threat on its eastern edge, France erected a series of forts throughout the Mississippi River basin. In 1718, the city of New Orleans was founded by Louisiana Governor Jean-Baptiste Lamont, Sieur de Bienville, at the river's mouth on its wide, fertile delta. All commerce down the Mississippi from the interior of the continent now had to pass through this port city. The French went on to erect forts upriver at the mouths of the Kaskaskia in 1720, the Illinois in 1726, and the Missouri River in 1723. French colonists from Canada eventually immigrated to the Mississippi River Valley. However, life in subtropical Louisiana was tough, and France couldn't entice immigrants to this frontier city. Consequently, New Orleans became an odd combination of black slaves, Native Americans, German Catholics, French criminals, and the original traders and trappers. New Orleans' reputation was one of hardship, corruption, and disease. A priest described the situation.
A man with his wife or his partner clears a little ground, builds himself a house on 4 piles, covers it with sheets of bark, and plants corn and rice for his provisions. The next year raises a little more food, and also a field of tobacco. If at last he succeeds in having 3 or 4 Negroes, then he is out of his difficulties.
Despite all its troubles, New Orleans continued to grow even though the Louisiana colony was a tremendous financial burden to France. In 1763, France ceded the colony to Spain, which held it until 1800 when it ceded New Orleans and Louisiana back to France. The city and land traded hands a third time when the United States' third president, Thomas Jefferson, purchased the Louisiana colony, now called the Louisiana Territory, from Napoleon in 1803. In the War of 1812, the decisive Battle of New Orleans propelled America into a position of a world power. From the 18th century to the 21st century, New Orleans has remained a pivotal port city for shipping from the continental interior, in a peculiar way fulfilling La Salle's dream of an agricultural and manufacturing empire. The colonial children of the first half of the 18th century would be the revolutionaries that would transform the Earth's political and social institutions in the form of the American Revolution. A revolution that would create the great American experiment. It was an experiment dependent for its success on a literate, educated, and informed citizenry.
Every free man, in order to preserve his freedom, must have a knowledge of mankind, a knowledge of the principles of the government and the Constitution he lives under, a knowledge of all the laws that immediately affect his conduct and interest. William Manning, Key to Liberty.
It was a remarkable idea. Exclude no one from education. In Europe, only the rich could afford to educate their children, often with a private tutor. But in the American colonies in the last half of the 17th century, the notion was brewing that every child, regardless of background, economic condition, or class, should get an education. It was an idea that was easier to expound than to put into action. Education for all meant the building of schools and finding teachers. However, as the colonists moved out of their survival mode, they were able to focus more attention on education. As a Massachusetts colonist put it,
After God carried us safe to New England and we had built our houses, provided necessaries for our livelihood, reared convenient places for God's worship, and settled the civil government, one of the next things we longed for and looked after was to advance learning and perpetuate it in posterity.
The Founding Fathers believed everyone should have a good education, but they feared the tyranny of a central authority. For this reason, they left control of schools to individual states, making no mention of education in the Constitution. In 1723, the Maryland Assembly began the process of putting free public education on a strong footing when it mandated that each of its counties have a public school. After that, there was no stopping the push to secure free education for all Americans. So that today, America's schools and education are seen as the possibility of success for anyone, no matter what their parents' background or economic condition. The Chesapeake Bay stretches for nearly 200 miles before it finally reaches the Atlantic Ocean. Ranging up to 20 miles in width, nearly 150 rivers and creeks feed into it. The land surrounding the bay is ideal for growing one of America's most prolific weeds, tobacco. Tobacco was the cash crop for the colonists in the late 17th century and the early 18th century. In order to grow tobacco, it was necessary to divide the land surrounding Chesapeake Bay into large farm parcels. This broke the pattern of European village living. As George Sand lamented,
"For how is it possible to govern a people so dispersed, especially rabble, as for the most part are over here? And how can they repair to divine service, except every plantation have a minister? And how can we raise soldiers to go upon the enemy? Or workmen for the public employments without weakening them too much? Whereas, if we had planted together, we could have borne out one another's labor, and given both strength and beauty to the colony."
the Chesapeake Bay tobacco planters needed an outlet for their crops. So local landowners petitioned Maryland's governor to create a custom house built at a convenient spot to send their crops east. In response, on August 8, 1729, a bill establishing Baltimore to be that port was signed into law. The new city of Baltimore was now the westernmost seaport city in the colonies, and it grew rapidly. It was also the last of the great colonial port cities to be built. But it was the beginning of many American cities to be built solely on an economic foundation. By the time of the Revolutionary War, Baltimore had become a major shipping center. However, Baltimore's defining moment occurred during the War of 1812. When America declared war on Britain, one British admiral vowed, "Baltimore is a doomed town." Fortunately, the British could not make good on the admiral's claim. For in 1814, Baltimore's Fort McHenry stood fast as Britain's troops and navy attacked it by land and sea. This defense, recorded in Francis Scott Key's The Star-Spangled Banner, perhaps saved the young nation of the United States. Following the war, Baltimore's response to New York's completion of the Erie Canal was the establishment of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, connecting it to points west in the old Northwest Territory. Today, Baltimore is experiencing a revival and is one of the 20 largest cities in the country. Looking out on the vast network of roads that span America in the 21st century, it is hard to imagine that the primary means of land transportation for the early English colonists was walking along Indian trails. If the English colonies of the 18th century were to become a cohesive unit, they needed to be connected. The first intercolonial transportation was by boat up and down the coast. But by 1711, a postal road had been completed between New York and Boston. There was a growing recognition that the flow of letters and communication between the colonies was absolutely necessary for their survival. The time it took for a letter in 1717 to travel between Boston and Williamsburg, Virginia, was 4 weeks in good weather and 8 weeks in the winter. Eventually, ground transportation other than by foot or horse would be necessary to carry goods and people throughout the colonies. The first step towards this goal was taken when a New Jersey newspaper, the Mercury, ran this ad. "Gentlemen, merchants, tradesmen, and travelers, Solomon Smith and James Moore keep 2 stage wagons intending to go from Burlington to Amboy and back." Thus, the first stagecoach in 1732 began operation. The line connected people traveling from Philadelphia by boat to Burlington, New Jersey, there boarding the stagecoach traveling to Amboy, New Jersey, and then by boat once again to New York City. Or they could travel from New York to Philadelphia in the same fashion. Stagecoaches and other horse-drawn wagons demanded better roads, and by the time of the Revolution, a system of highways was well enough established to be used as a reliable means of transportation between the colonies, thus helping to surmount the insularity of the colonies and knit them together into an American country. The stagecoach went on to be glorified in the 19th century and was finally replaced by the railroads. Georgia, the last of the original 13 British colonies, would in later years be glorified as a beautiful place of piney woods and in politics as the stronghold of Southern culture. But its humble beginnings were both altruistic and worldly. The year was 1732. The population of America had swollen to over 650,000. Settlers had expanded the colonial frontier east to the Appalachian Mountains, which protected the colonists from the French to the north and west. However, America's southern flank remained uncertain since both Spain and Britain claimed the land between Spanish Florida and the Carolina colonies. 2 decades earlier, Queen Anne's War had proved inconclusive, and Britain now sought the remedy to the situation. The solution was the founding of Georgia Colony by General James Oglethorpe, in his own words, to help the industrious yet unfortunate poor. The idea of the Georgia Colony was brilliant. New settlers would protect Britain's southern flank from Spain and Indians, and as planned, the colony would be populated immediately by the huge number of debtors from England's prisons. Pamphlets extolled Georgia as a paradise on earth. Settlers from Great Britain and Northern Europe, eager for a new start, paid their own way. Debtors from English prisons were given a way out of jail. The colony forbade slavery, lawyers, and the importation of rum in order to promote hard work and self-reliance. All England backed this project as a means to help relieve the jails of overcrowding by the debtors. Parliament appropriated £136,608 to see the colony through its beginning. Georgia succeeded in its worldly mission, but ultimately failed in its humanitarian endeavors. During the War of Jenkins' Ear, 1739 to 1742, General Oglethorpe was successful in his campaigns against Florida, thus fulfilling the function of protecting the colony's southern borders from Spain and hostile Indians. However, within 20 years, the plantation system used in Virginia and the Carolinas became a way of life in Georgia, and slavery was allowed. By the beginning of the 19th century, Georgia would become the epitome of a southern state. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the colonies were not a healthy place to live, especially in the South with its semi-tropical environment. In fact, death was such a major player in North America, the colonies could not have survived in the first few years without the continual influx of new people. Indeed, the world itself was very unsanitary, and colonies from their inauspicious beginnings and into the 20th century experienced the same outbreaks of malaria, dysentery, typhoid fever, diphtheria, measles, whooping cough, and smallpox and influenza that plagued Europe and other continents. Settlers in the colonies were more likely to die from an infectious disease than from war, accident, and old age combined. In 1732, the colonies participated for the first time in a worldwide pandemic, the outbreak of influenza. When it was over, thousands of people had died. In this odd way, the colonies joined the world of nations. At that time, medicine was primitive. The idea that diseases could be classified and treated separately was just emerging in the minds of a few natural scientists. Public health was non-existent, and doctors were held in ill repute. As one Virginian put it,
Virginians have the happiness that they have very few doctors.
What did work medically in the colonies was simple seasoning. If an immigrant survived a number of these outbreaks of infectious disease and gained a kind of immunity or hardiness, that hardiness could, to some extent, be passed on to his or her children. One big step in dealing with the epidemics was taken by Cotton Mather, America's first Renaissance individual. In the 1720s, he campaigned tirelessly for smallpox inoculation against the protests of so-called physicians. By the beginning of the Revolutionary War, this procedure was well accepted throughout the colonies. George Washington insisted that his men be inoculated. But by far, Native Americans experienced the greatest impact from European epidemics. With no natural immunities, most of the original native cultures were destroyed or severely weakened as the European diseases wiped out societal leadership, clearing the way for European settlement long before a single white person had contact with a specific Native American tribe. This devastation of Native Americans continued well into the 19th century, when the Plains Indians finally lost their way of life in conjunction with the gold rush of 1849. After the pandemic of 1732, medicine in the U.S. would not greatly advance for another 100 years. In Great Britain during the 17th and 18th century, two products from the New World were king: tobacco, which came from Britain's Atlantic seaboard colonies, and sugar, which came from her colonies in the West Indies. In fact, from the beginning, Britain's settlement of the New World fell into two distinct colonial assets. One was her American colonies, which would eventually become the United States. The other was a chain of small tropical islands in the Caribbean. This ring of volcanic peaks was highly fertile and ideal for growing sugarcane. Some of the islands were controlled by France, Spain, and the Netherlands. The English islands were Barbados and Jamaica. In 1650, more white settlers lived on these two islands than all the eastern seaboard colonies combined. The main crop of the islands was sugar, and producing it was a complex, labor-intensive affair. Cut sugarcane spoiled quickly, if not processed immediately. It had to be harvested, milled, and boiled in a very short period of time, all in the steaming heat of the tropics. The end products were brown sugar and molasses, which could then be turned into rum. The sugar planters needed a large compliant labor force to perform the harvesting and manufacturing of sugar products. They quickly learned that whites would not do this work. The solution was the vast importation of slaves from Africa. The culture that quickly arose on the islands was a minority white elite who owned the plantations, ancillary businesses and crafts, and a black slave majority who performed all the menial labor. By the 18th century, the seeds of this societal structure had been transplanted to the American South, where they flourished. In 1733, the ruling elite on the West Indies Islands asked the British Parliament to pass legislation restricting the American colonies to trade for sugar and molasses only with their islands. Passage of the Molasses Act, as it was called, upset the American colonies. Although the act went largely unenforced, it demonstrated to the American colonists that Britain was not concerned with their economic interests. A secondary consequence was that the colonies continued to trade with the French West Indies through smuggling. This produced a separate non-British industry, one that heightened the sense of the colonies' need for independence. America is a nation of laws. Laws and their interpretations that are finally arbitrated by a jury of ordinary citizens. As a result, the nation's sentiment and mind has always been partially defined by a series of famous jury trials. The first in this long tradition of spectacular trials is the case of German printer Peter Zenger. Like the other American colonies in 1731, New York was ruled by a governor appointed by officials in Britain. That year, the newly arriving governor was William Cosby. Described as a spiteful, creepy, and quick-tempered man, he quickly alienated influential citizens when he fired Chief Justice Lewis Morris over salary claims. As a result, a new political faction was formed, the Popular Party, which challenged Cosby's ability to govern. The party appealed to Peter Zenger, one of two printers in the colony, to publish a newspaper called the New York Weekly Journal. In the paper's second issue, an editorial appeared about Governor Cosby.
The loss of liberty in general would soon follow the suppression of the liberty of the press, for it is an essential branch of liberty, so perhaps it is the best preservation of the whole.
Cosby immediately ordered Zenger's newspapers be burned in public and that the printer be arrested for libel. Months later, his trial began on July 29, 1735. 12 jurors were seated in spite of Cosby's attempts to rig the jury process. In defense of Peter Zenger was Andrew Hamilton, perhaps the most prestigious Philadelphia lawyer of the time. Hamilton argued that the libel law of England ought not to be the libel law of New York, and took the position that truth should be the defense of the charge of libel.
The cause of English liberty is at stake, the liberty of exposing and opposing arbitrary power by speaking and writing the truth. Andrew Hamilton.
In Hamilton's closing statement, he made a glorious plea for liberty in the free press.
The loss of liberty to a generous mind is worse than death. A man who loves his country prefers its liberty to all other considerations, well knowing that life without liberty is a misery. The question before you in the court, gentlemen of the jury, is not of small private concern. It's not the cause of one poor printer, nor of New York alone. No! It may, in its consequences, affect every free man that lives under a British government on the main of America.
The jury deliberated a short time and returned with the verdict of not guilty. Zenger's acquittal is considered the foundation of American freedom of the press. One of the drafters of the Bill of Rights, Lewis Morrison's great-grandson, wrote of this decision,
The trial of Zenger in 1735 was the germ of American freedom, the morning star of that liberty which subsequently revolutionized American freedom.
However, at the time of the Zenger trial, printing and the press did not come easily in the colonies. While printing flourished in Europe, it was hard to find printing presses in the colonies. England and the colonies' governors considered free information among its subjects dangerous. Gradually, by the time of the Revolution, there were 37 independent newspapers in the colonies. Today, America, with all its newspapers, magazines, and television, values freedom of speech over any other nation. He has been described as short, slight of build, and cross-eyed. He was young, only 25 years old when he arrived in Philadelphia from England in 1739, on his way to set up an orphanage in Savannah, Georgia. But he was a preacher, the likes of which had never been seen before in the colonies. He was George Whitefield, and his sermons would forever change the social and religious landscape of America. The event that Whitefield initiated was called the Great Awakening, and was second only to Martin Luther's Reformation in transforming Christianity. Before Whitefield's arrival, the colonies were predominantly Protestant, divided into sects that were largely hostile to each other. However, Americans at that time were the least church-going people in the Western world. In New England in 1721, 75% of the people shunned the church. Yet thousands came to hear Whitefield, who was a fire and brimstone preacher. Whether he preached from a pulpit or in the field, Whitefield's sermons, delivered in his unique theatrical style, appealed to the emotions and the heart while disdaining any church doctrine. In one of his most notable addresses, Whitefield thundered,
Father Abraham, who have you in heaven? Any Episcopalians? No. Any Presbyterians? No. Any Independents or Methodists? No, no, no. Whom have you there? We don't know those names here. All who are here are Christians.
Whitefield's revival-style meetings spread throughout the colonies until 1744, when the Great Awakening sputtered to a humble end. But the changes the Awakening brought about continued. The monolithic sect splintered into numerous denominations that were suited to individual preferences. Through this proliferation, they became less hostile to each other, which helped to break down barriers between colonies. The experience of the Great Awakening also cut across class lines, so that people no longer defined themselves in terms of class distinctions. Revival meetings were attended by young and old, rich and poor, educated and illiterate, men and women, and were even open to blacks and Native Americans. The result was social status became more fluid, supporting the purely American philosophy, anyone can make it. The newly enlightened of the Great Awakening turned their attention to education, founding many of today's Ivy League schools, including Princeton and Dartmouth. Science and natural history became acceptable areas of study. All sides of American society, religious and secular, moved toward the separation of church and state. Keep government out of religion, and religion out of government. The Great Awakening also promoted individualism, and voluntary organizations became the favorite way for carrying out programs that have previously been done by the church. This form of political and membership organization flourished in the 19th century and remains a prominent feature of the American landscape. Today, fire and brimstone preachers can still be found on TV or sermonizing under a tent, but never again has American society been dominated by this evangelical style of Christianity, as were the colonies from 1739 to 1744. George Whitefield himself died in Philadelphia in 1770. Along this river in Charleston, South Carolina, would occur an event that would seal the fate of race relations in the United States for the next 270 years. During the 18th century, black slavery was endemic in the British colonies, as well as the Spanish and French colonies. Slavery started early in
1619 with the arrival at Jamestown, Virginia,
of a ship carrying 20 black slaves. For the next 189 years, ships arriving from West Africa carried black slaves as cargo to the New World in the largest forced migration the world has ever seen. The black Africans were transported in the most dreadful of conditions. Only in the 18th century, when the European style of farming was replaced by the large plantations started in the Chesapeake Bay area of Maryland and the tidewater areas of Virginia and Carolina, did their numbers grow. By the year 1739, South Carolina had over 32,000 slaves, and blacks were the majority population. A Swiss visitor at the time wrote, "This colony looks more like a Negro country than a country settled by white people." In South Carolina, black opposition to slavery was a way of life. and the potential for open violence terrified many whites. Consequently, colonial officials urged armed militias to patrol for suspicious blacks. By the summer of 1739, South Carolina's black majority seethed with resistance to slavery. Many of the slaves in the area came from present-day Angola, Africa, spoke the same language, and had kinship ties. But most of all, they were united by the drumbeat of freedom and the cry of liberty. Very quickly, in many counties, open rebellion erupted. In Charleston, a group of slaves set out for St. Augustine, Florida, and freedom. Before they were stopped, 21 whites and 44 blacks were killed. In the township of Berkeley, slaves struck again for freedom. But the most imposing revolt happened at Stono River. There, a slave named Cato led a group of 20 slaves against their white masters. They killed 2 warehouse guards and stole guns and gunpowder and fled south, killing whites and gathering more slaves as they went until their numbers swelled to 80. South Carolina officials called out the militia, which subdued the revolt. 25 whites and 50 blacks were killed in the battle. But the effects of the Stono slave rebellion reached far into the future and cemented for all time Southern fears of blacks. It drew the color line with a bold marker and forbade anyone to help blacks. By 1740, the slavery system in colonial America was fully developed. From 1713 to 1739, France, Spain, and Britain coexisted in relative peace, and these European nations used this time to extend their influence in North America. The British colonies pushed westward to Appalachia. The French tightened their hold on Canada and the Mississippi River Valley, and Spain strengthened her grip on Florida and the American Southwest. But a vast triangle of land, the Ohio River Basin, west of the Appalachian Mountains, remained in dispute. In an odd way, this area, so remote to Britain and France, would soon become the central issue in a war that began in the Caribbean, the War of Jenkins' Ear. Hostilities began when Captain Robert Jenkins, for whom the war was named, complained to Parliament that his ear had been removed unlawfully by Spanish authorities. This was a lie. Jenkins was one of the many English traders who smuggled goods into Spanish-controlled South America and Florida. He was caught and his ear removed as a warning to other trespassers. But Parliament saw the chance to strike at Spain in her only vulnerable spot, the New World. It declared war against the advice of the English Prime Minister, Robert Walpole. Walpole, in an eerie forewarning of the events to come 35 years later, observed,
They now ring the bells of war, but they will soon wring their hands.
Britain's southern colonies responded the moment war was declared. Governor James Oglethorpe called on the citizens of Georgia and South Carolina to join an invasion of Florida and quickly captured 2 forts. Spain retaliated by attempting to invade those colonies by sea and mounted an attack on Georgia's Fort Frederica. The Spanish were repulsed in a bloody battle that was a decisive engagement of the war. Governor Oglethorpe also attacked St. Augustine, Florida, but was forced to retreat when Spanish forces threatened his rear guard. The War of Jenkins' Ear quickly broadened to include France and became known in the colonies as King George's War. Much of the fighting shifted to Canada. Of great significance was the colonial attack on the French fort of Louisbourg. On June 17, 1745, the fort fell to an American fleet of some 90 vessels. The capture of Louisbourg disrupted France's trade for furs among the Indian tribes of the rich Ohio River Basin, and for a time, a window of opportunity opened for American fur traders. Almost single-handedly, George Croghan of Pennsylvania captured the Ohio River fur trade for the British. The war ended in 1748, and all the captured territories returned to their pre-war status. This British decision angered the colonists, echoing Prime Minister Walpole's warning. The war did, however, set the stage for the French and Indian War, which would determine who among the European powers would become supreme in North America. What do the lazy Platte River, Nebraska, and the chilly coast of Alaska have in common? Both were part of 2 major explorations in the mid-18th century, and both would assume major roles as the descendants of the British colonies migrated across the continent under the aegis of Manifest Destiny in the 19th century. By 1739, the French had established forts up and down the Mississippi River. Starting from Fort Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, Missouri, 2 Canadian brothers, Pierre and Paul Mallet, and 6 other Frenchmen began a journey of critical discovery. They traveled up the Missouri and then followed a wide, shallow river they would name the Platte, eventually reaching the foothills of the Rocky Mountains near present-day Denver, Colorado. They would be the first Europeans to see those magnificent peaks. From there, the exploration team traveled south to Santa Fe, New Mexico, a Spanish trading center at that time. The brothers continued the French tradition of exploration for which the French were particularly well suited. They were excellent frontiersmen, capable of living off the land and in harmony with the Native Americans. The route the French brothers traversed would be repeated thousands of times in the 19th century. The land itself would become the core of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and by the middle of the 19th century, countless covered wagons would follow in the Malay brothers' footsteps on the first leg of the Oregon Trail as pioneers traveled to the west coast of the continent. While the interior of North America was yielding its secrets to the intrepid French brothers, the west coast remained ill-defined in the minds of the Europeans, until a Danish explorer, Vitus Bering, surveying the chilly waters of the sea that now bears his name. This proved conclusively that North America was a separate continent from Asia. In two major expeditions, Vitus Bering explored the coasts of Alaska. As a result, Alaska became a focal point for Russian exploration and a rich center for its fur trade. Later, thousands of Russians would migrate to this vast land, and eventually Alaska would become a Russian territory. A territory which it would sell to the U.S. in 1867 for $7.2 million. Alaska became the 49th state in 1959, whereas Nebraska, bisected by the Demtsil Platte River and named for the Omaha Indian word meaning broad river, joined the Union as the 38th state in 1867.
Land being cheap in that country, hardy young laboring men who understand the husbandry of corn and cattle may easily establish themselves there. Multitudes of poor people from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Germany have by this means in a few years become wealthy farmers who in their own countries could never have emerged from the poor condition wherein they were born. Benjamin Franklin.
The land Benjamin Franklin wrote about was the vast country of the Ohio River Basin west of the Appalachian Mountains. By 1740, the North American population reached 700,000, and by 1750 it exceeded 1 million. Scots, Irish, and German immigrants flooded into the British colonies seeking homesteads. Problems arose from the scarcity of good agricultural land. The most suitable farmland along the coasts had already been settled, and as the immigrants pushed westward, they quickly came up against the barrier of the Appalachian Mountains. But on the other side of the Appalachians lay the fertile lands of the Ohio River Basin. This country, however, was controlled by the French through their network of strategic forts built in the first half of the century and with the help of their Indian allies. The colonies, on the other hand, claimed this area, citing their charters which granted them the land westward to the Pacific Ocean. As the War of Jenkins' Ear concluded in 1748, the British began to believe that they could actually control all of these lands in the interior of the continent. It was a belief that would be readily adopted by the Americans at the end of the Revolutionary War, and in the 19th century would extend to the entire continent through the rationale of manifest destiny. The first step in this process began with the creation of the Ohio Land Company in 1747. Formed by a consortium of London merchants and Virginia planters, the company's mission was to open up the western Ohio lands as a source of raw materials and eventual settlement. By 1748, traders representing the Ohio Company were in the Ohio Territory. In the same year, other colonial agents established a settlement west of the Allegheny Divide, and the first western land rush was on. The French, however, still claimed these lands as their own, and within 6 years these colonizing efforts would lead to the French and Indian War, which would settle once and for all who would control the North American continent. While European immigrants poured into the British colonies along the Atlantic seaboard during the first half of the 18th century, another migration occurred just as vast, covering even a larger amount of land, as Native Americans poured onto the North American Great Plains. Horses had evolved in the North American continent, but when Europeans arrived in the 16th century, they had become extinct. The reintroduction of horses by Spanish conquistadors transformed Native American life. In 1680, the Pueblo Indian revolt in northern New Mexico drove their Spanish overlords south. As the Spanish retreated, they left behind much of their livestock, including hundreds of horses. Within a generation, wild horses spread north, and with them a new culture evolved in the Great Plains, one based on hunting buffalo from horseback instead of on foot. East of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, former village-dwelling tribes such as the Crow, Cheyenne, and Kiowa adopted horses and moved onto the plains to follow the buffalo herds, eagerly embracing a semi-nomadic lifestyle. In particular, the Lakota became the northern powerhouse of the plains, and to the south the Comanche established a powerful empire of their own. These new nomadic tribes suddenly had a highly improved lifestyle, and as a consequence their populations swelled. At the same time, French traders exchanged guns for buffalo hides, so that by 1750 the Plains Indians developed into a warrior culture. A French trader of that period described the Pawnee village after warriors returned with dead comrades from a raid on the Comanche.
Holding a bow in one hand and an arrow in the other, the mothers sang near the bodies of their sons in a song both gay and martial, thanking them for having given them the satisfaction of seeing men die at the hands of the enemy.
Of the Europeans, it was the Spanish who felt the wrath of the Plains Indians. For the first time, a Native American population defeated a European power, as a Presidio commander in Texas noted in 1759.
The enemy is so superior in firearms, as well as in numbers, that our destruction seems probable.
Indeed, the northern frontier of Spain in the last part of the 18th century was constantly pushed southward. Ironically, the Native American horse cultures saved the West for the Americans who were establishing a new nation to the east, a nation whose power would eventually crush the horse culture 100 years later. The mighty American iron and steel industry that cast the machines which carried the United States through the Industrial Revolution and forged the nation into the preeminent world power of today can trace its origins back to small backyard forges in the 18th century. By 1750, every colony north of Virginia was dotted with small ironworks. At the center of the colonial iron industry was Pennsylvania, with over 70 iron plantations, company towns dedicated to the manufacture of iron products. Skilled craftsmen turned iron into hardware items equal to any in the world: scythes, pots, knives, axes, kettles, and perhaps most importantly, rifles. Long rifles that would be put into the hands of every frontiersman to defend his land from Indian attack, and every Minuteman to wage war on the British. From the inception of the colonies, the need to provide their own industry was a characteristic of the American experience. Leaders realized the colonies needed to be independent of the mother country, and one way to do this was the manufacture of ironware. Early on, the Massachusetts colony paid a bounty for the discovery of iron ore. However, it was the building of a forge in 1716 in the iron-rich Schuylkill Valley of Pennsylvania that would mark the true beginnings of the American iron industry. Here existed abundant iron ore, water, and timber to fuel the furnaces of iron manufacture. From the British perspective, the manufacturing of iron into useful products was not the way colonial trade should work. The colonies were supposed to send raw materials to the mother country in exchange for manufactured goods. Only now, they were creating finished iron goods, not only for themselves, but also for world export. The result was the idling of thousands of British iron workers. Consequently, in 1750, Britain's Parliament passed the Iron Act, which essentially forbid the building of new iron forges in the colonies, while at the same time encouraging the export of pig iron to Britain. The act was doomed to failure, especially since the British would soon rely heavily upon American manufacture during the French and Indian War. But the act pointed out the growing separation of interest between the colonies and Britain. In the last part of the 18th century, the Delaware Valley in Pennsylvania became the richest manufacturing center in North America. Although nearly all the colonies had manufactures of some kind, Pennsylvania's Delaware Valley, because of the abundance of iron and coal, outstripped the others with their production. The label land of opportunity might seem a trite phrase to those of us looking back 300 years, but the greatest industrial nation on the planet rose above the manufactures of Britain and Europe exactly because opportunity did exist in this wild, untamed land of the 18th century. In the next century, that opportunity would be exploited by men like Andrew Carnegie, who organized steel production into a monopoly that became the foundation of American industry well into the 20th century, driving the economy in everything from transportation to manufacturing. In the 21st century, it is humbling and informative to note that America's vast fortune and industrial might descended from small backyard forges and furnaces 300 years ago. As the 18th century dawned, American and European immigrants were on the move. No longer was life in the 13 colonies based on mere survival. A full-fledged economy was developing, an economy whose focus shifted as settlers moved inland from small port villages and subsistence farming near the coast to land settlement in the continent's interior and growing cities. To facilitate this expansion, a new means of transportation to carry large volumes of goods and people throughout the colonial interior became paramount. In 1750, an ingenious two-part solution came from the German-speaking people who settled in Pennsylvania. Conveniently, the Conestoga wagon and the flatboat made their appearance in that year. Although British immigrants dominated the limelight in the American colonies, there was at the same time a constant flow of Northern Europeans, mostly Germans, who settled in Pennsylvania. Like the British, the Germans often arrived as an entire family. By 1750, it was generally agreed they were the best farmers in the New World. Their industriousness meant they needed more efficient means of transporting their surplus goods to more distant markets. For land transportation, the Conestoga, a massive covered wagon, was the answer. Developed in the Pennsylvania county of Conestoga, it was built like a boat and could carry up to 3 tons of goods. Especially suited to the uneven colonial roads of the period, by the time of the American Revolution, over 10,000 of these vehicles existed. By the second half of the 18th century, all the good land of the original colonial settlements had been occupied. New and distant lands west of the mountains beckoned. In 1750, in the same Pennsylvania colony, a German, Jacob Yoder, designed the flatboat. This water vehicle carried huge amounts of goods and entire families downriver. Americans now had the means to push ever westward along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Within 3 generations, land covering 8 states from Wisconsin to Alabama would be settled. Eventually, the flatboat would give way to the steamboat, which had the advantage of being able to go upriver. The Conestoga wagon faced competition for carrying goods as America's canal system arose in the first part of the 19th century. Later, the wagon evolved into the smaller prairie schooner and carried pioneers along the Oregon and Western trails. It was finally replaced in the latter part of the 1800s by the railroads.
It is proposed humble application be made for an Act of Parliament of Great Britain, by virtue of which one general government may be formed in America, including all the said colonies, within and under which government each colony may retain its present constitution, that the said general government be administered by a President General, to be appointed and supported by the Crown, and a Grand Council to be chosen by the representatives of the people. Benjamin Franklin.
These opening lines of a plan for an intercolonial union were presented to representatives at a meeting in Albany, New York in the year 1754. Many of these delegates had been born in the United States and had never been to Europe. Perhaps the most fitting question to ask of this moment in history was, were these men British subjects, or were they becoming something else? At Albany, Benjamin Franklin argued that they were becoming something else, and to underscore his point, ran in his Pennsylvania Gazette newspaper a woodcut of a disjointed snake with the nation's first slogan, "Join or die." However, Franklin soon realized that in 1754 the time was not yet right for union.
Everyone cries a union is necessary, but when they come to the manner and form of the union, their weak noodles are perfectly distracted. Benjamin Franklin.
Franklin's Albany plan of union was doomed to failure from the start. The colonies were still not sufficiently enjoined to form a union against the common enemy. The necessity of union would be shown them in the French and Indian War, and the actions by the Crown in the decade following the war's end. But the plan was important in that it laid out the blueprint for the representative kind of government that would later bear fruit in the Constitution of the United States. In James Fenimore Cooper's novel, The Last of the Mohicans, a dramatic battle was waged at Fort William Henry in upstate New York. It was an attack on a British fort by a large contingent of Canadian militia, French regulars, and Native Americans, an attack that ended in defeat for the British. This battle was part of a larger war, the French and Indian War, a war that would determine the fate of the North American continent. Canada and America grew up together. They were created to promote the welfare of their respective mother countries, France and England. Canada, called New France at the inception of the war, was mostly one large military outpost from Fort Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island to Fort Michilimack in Michigan. In many ways, New France was better prepared for war. It had by far the largest holding of the North American continent. More importantly, most of the Native American nations supported the French. New France's greatest weakness, on the other hand, were its tiny white population, only 55,000 compared to over 1 million settlers in the British colony, and a lack of industry, so that it depended on imports from France for its war goods. These would eventually prove to be its fatal flaws. The French and Indian War was a continuation of the War of Jenkins' Ear, which had allowed the British colonies a toehold west of the Appalachians, land the French claimed as their own. The war began when a young George Washington, leading a contingent of Virginia militia near Uniontown, Pennsylvania, ordered his men to fire on the small party of French. A year later, the well-known British General Braddock and a small army were routed at the same place. Known as the Battle of the Wilderness, this decisive defeat of the British forces and American militia turned the French and Indian War into the bitter North American campaign it would become. Two men, who would later become famous Americans, fought at this defeat: George Washington and Daniel Boone. Washington wrote of this engagement, "We've been beaten, most shamefully beaten, by a handful of men." Thus the first round went to the French, as did much of the early war. Part of the reason for the British defeat was that the French had adopted the Indian style of fighting, hiding behind rocks and trees. This style would later be copied by the colonial militias in the Revolutionary War. In the first 3 years of the war, the French won handily in battles along the western frontier and on the border with Canada. However, in 1758, William Pitt came into power in England and brought with him a new approach to the war.
I believe that I can save this nation and that no one else can. William Pitt.
The old British strategy was to contain the French in the New World while winning the war in Europe. Pitt turned this completely around. He made America the main theater of the war and launched a global North American campaign, sending the best military minds to the New World. The strategy worked. In 1758, General Forbes occupied an abandoned Fort Duquesne in western Pennsylvania, while in New York, William Johnson captured Fort Niagara. General Jeffrey Amherst seized Ticonderoga, and John Bradstreet took Fort Frontenac. In 1759, the brilliant commander James Wolfe, whose forces had taken Fort Louisburg a year earlier, captured Quebec at the cost of his own life. A year later, Montreal surrendered, and Canada belonged to Britain. The French and Indian War officially ended in 1763 with a treaty signed in Paris. France gave up Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, and all the rest of Canada. In addition, France gave Britain all the territory east of the Mississippi except New Orleans. In return, France got back its Caribbean islands, and Britain returned Cuba to Spain in exchange for western Florida. The battle for the North American continent was over, and the British had won. For the American colonies, the effects of the French defeat were emphatic. With the French out of the way in North America, the colonies no longer needed the British for protection from outside enemies. The war also showed that the military men of the colonies, men like Washington and Johnson, were equal to, if not better, than their British counterparts. Lastly, the most important effect of the defeat was political. The war gave rise to the notion that the colonies could work together for their own defense, and that would lead, after 20 years of oppressive British rule, to the American Revolution. He is the least known of the United States founding fathers. He reportedly coined the phrase, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." And with John Adams looking on, he was the first American lawyer to argue in court for the doctrine of natural law, the underlying rights of all citizens which would form the base of the Bill of Rights. By 1760, Britain was winning the French and Indian War. However, there was alarm over the amount of colonial shipping that was still going to France. Armed with writs of assistance, customs officials searched for illegal cargoes and soon were pulling in shipments worth thousands of pounds. Writs were general warrants that allowed naval officers and customs officials to search private property without offering evidence of suspected smuggled goods. Boston merchants needed someone to take up their cause. James Otis took the case without pay. In February 1760, Otis argued the case, a case that he lost. But his 4-hour argument brought into focus the fundamental principle of security, which was close to the heart of every American colonist. Otis's presentation had such a strong effect on John Adams and others, as it laid the foundation for the Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. 50 years later, John Adams said of Otis's argument, "Then and there, the child independence was born." For a brief moment in American history, he had welded the Indian nations of the upper Great Lakes region into a powerful adversary of the British colonies. Now he stood outside an old French trading post. Within a few seconds, he would be dead at the hands of Black Dog, a Peoria Indian. With the death of Chief Pontiac in 1769, ended the first Native American War for independence. At the time of the French and Indian War, from 1754 to 1763, Great Lakes Indian tribes with their French allies controlled the area later known as the Old Northwest Territory, west of the Appalachian Mountains. If Native Americans trusted and respected the French, whose trappers lived among them and sought nothing but trade, it was a corollary that they distrusted the British, who had virtually exterminated the tribes along the Atlantic seacoast. Pontiac, like many other Native Americans, willingly fought alongside the French in the French and Indian War to stem the British advance. In 1763, Pontiac and other Indian leaders learned that France was ceding all of Canada and eastern Louisiana to Britain. However, Pontiac was not willing to give up. He responded to the peace treaty with words that showed the desperateness of the Indian cause.
It is important for us, my brothers, that we exterminate from this land this nation which seeks to destroy us. When the English are defeated, we shall stop up the ways hither, so that they may never come upon our lands again.
In a brilliant piece of strategy, Pontiac launched simultaneous attacks on British outposts. The garrison of Sandusky, Ohio, Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Niles, Michigan fell within a month. Pontiac's successes stirred other tribes to join the Confederacy against the English. All along the western frontier, Chippewas, Senecas, and Delawares, among others, attacked forts and settlements. Fort Michilimack on the straits between Huron and Lake Michigan was wiped out in June. The British fought back. General Jeffrey Ambrose, whose forces had led to the successful conclusion of the French and Indian War, sent reinforcements to Forts Pitt and Detroit. But the British counterattacks did not stem the fighting, and Amherst contemplated sending smallpox-infected blankets among the Indians, but was deterred by the risk of infecting his own troops. Late in 1763, the French told Pontiac he could not expect any help from them and that he should make peace with the British. Pontiac wrote the British,
"The word which my father has sent me to make peace, I have accepted. All my young men have buried their hatchets."
A formal peace was concluded in 1766 at a council of Western and Eastern chiefs at Oswego, New York. In a sense, Pontiac won his war when the British agreed to a line of proclamation that forbade colonists from settling west of a boundary drawn along the spine of the Appalachians. But Pontiac's war also showed the fragile nature of any Indian confederacy. The last attempt at such a union would end with the Battle of Tippecanoe and the defeat of Tecumseh's Federation nearly 50 years later in present-day Indiana. Independent by nature, not understanding the white man's laws, the Indian tribes could be bargained with separately, and the result was the piecemeal selling of their lands, which would eventually lead to the removal of all Indian nations east of the Mississippi River by 1840. It seemed harmless enough. A little stamp on legal documents. Certainly not something that would launch a revolution. But the Stamp Act of 1765, part of a series of taxes imposed by Britain on her American colonies, did just that. It started the American Revolution. 2 years before, Britain had won the French and Indian War, gaining Canada and the Mississippi River Basin from France. But the cost of the war had been high. Now the country was experiencing an economic depression, and the government was in debt. Britain's new Lord of the Treasury, George Grenville, drew up a plan to reduce that debt through a series of taxes on the colonies. At the time, Americans were the least taxed people in the Western world, and the British Parliament thought that the colonies would go along with new taxes to help the mother country. However, the British government made two fundamental mistakes. It did not understand the sentiment on taxation in the colonies, and it misjudged its own supremacy over America. The reaction to the Stamp Act was explosive. Since the Stamp Act required a fee or tax for all documents and newspapers, it affected every aspect of colonial life from commerce to marriage. To get the stamp, one needed to pay the government. Virginia reacted first. A young Patrick Henry, one of the great heroes of the American Revolution, rose in the Virginia House of Burgesses to read 7 resolutions against the Stamp Act. Old Guard members of the House reacted with cries of treason, to which Patrick Henry answered, "If this be treason, then make the most of it." Henry's resolutions against the Stamp Act were printed and widely circulated throughout the colonies. The reaction was at once momentous and even violent. In the fall of 1765, what became known as the Stamp Act Congress convened in New York. It consisted of representatives from 9 of the colonies. It was the first time the colonies had come together on their own. After 2.5 weeks, they accepted the right of the British Parliament to make laws for them, but rejected its right to tax them. Other reactions to the Stamp Act were more violent. Mobs calling themselves the Sons of Liberty attacked tax distributors, ransacking their homes and businesses. Britain's reaction to colonial protests were ambiguous. At that moment, Britain could have taken control of the colonies, but it did not. Instead, in the name of expediency, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act without it really ever taking effect. In that moment, the colonies were lost. The American Revolution had begun, and most of the British did not even know it, and a little stamp took its monumental place in history. They met late at night, in secret, so as to not attract attention from British officials. Their members came from the middle and upper classes. The British saw them as terrorists. They saw themselves as freedom fighters. They were the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty was a secret society, springing up simultaneously in Massachusetts and New York in the year of 1765. Affiliates would soon spread throughout all the colonies. Their purpose was to organize patriotic action and shape public opinion against Britain. Ironically, the name Sons of Liberty derived from a debate in the British Parliament when Charles Townshend, a key proponent of taxes on the colonies, described them as
Children planted by our care, nourished by our indulgence, and protected by our arms.
In response, a colonial defender called these patriots Sons of Liberty. Originally, the Sons of Liberty arose in opposition to the stamp tax of 1765. But after its repeal, they continued to foment colonial unrest by publicly condemning the idea of any external tax from Britain. The Sons of Liberty would incite mobs to violence against customs and tax officials. Their most famous protest would be called by later generations the Boston Tea Party. They also urged the seizing of a British cutter, the Gaspee, after it had run aground near Warwick, Rhode Island. They burned the ship and wounded the captain. Later, no one in Rhode Island would testify against the men responsible. Two of the most famous members of the Sons of Liberty were John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Adams, a true believer in the cause of liberty and freedom, was the most renowned firebrand of the American Revolution. A powerful writer, he disseminated his ideas in correspondence that circulated throughout the colonies. The most famous was the circular letter written in 1768.
An essential, unalterable right in nature, that what man hath freely and honestly acquired is absolutely his own, which he may freely give, but cannot be taken from him without his consent. Samuel Adams.
If Samuel Adams was the ideological leader of the Sons of Liberty, John Hancock was their patron. In fact, some would say Hancock, the richest man in Boston, bankrolled the American Revolution. Hancock would go on to serve as president of the Continental Congress. The first sign of the Declaration of Independence, his bold signature prompted such expressions as, "Put your John Hancock here," and "as good as my John Hancock." The Sons of Liberty disbanded in 1783, but there's little doubt that their clandestine and often violent activities played a major role in inciting the American Revolution. It is a stunning painting. Its artist, an American, was John Singleton Copley, and he painted Boy with a Squirrel in 1766. This portrait of George Washington was painted by another American artist, a student of Copley's, Charles Wilson Peale, in 1772. Though influenced by English artists, both men recorded the vast changes happening in the colonies from a uniquely American perspective. Copley excelled at portraiture, and all his colonial portraits are remarkable for their genuineness. His best known is of the Boston silversmith Paul Revere in 1768. Charles W. Peale was known for his portraits of George Washington. He painted his first Washington in 1772 and went on to paint over 50 more of the American patriot who was revered by his fellow Americans with the words, "First in war, first in peace, and first in the minds of his countrymen." Together, these men and other American artists captured the figures and events in colonial America in the 18th century. In time, the artistic style of these men would evolve into American Romanticism. He was an American original. The self-made man, the independent frontiersman who could go anywhere, start anything and succeed anytime. Daniel Boone, a man larger than life, captured the spirit of American independence and achievement. In the winter of 1767 and 68, Daniel Boone led a small group of men through the Cumberland Gap in the southwestern Appalachian Mountains. Portrait artists since have painted him standing on a precipice viewing Kentucky, the vast untamed wilderness awaiting settlement. This striking image captured brilliantly the allure the frontier has always held for Americans. 8 years later, financed by the Transylvania Land Company, Boone led a group of families into Kentucky and established Boonesboro. The trail he cut through the Cumberland Gap eventually became known as the Wilderness Road and carried thousands of settlers into Kentucky and beyond. At the same time that Boone established Boonesboro, nearby James Harrod founded Fort Harrod. Together, they would become a base of operations critically important to George Rogers Clark in his campaign to win the Ohio Territory from Britain during the American Revolutionary War. In 1792, Kentucky would become the 15th state. As for Boone, there is little doubt that he was the model for Natty Bumppo in James Fenimore Cooper's Leather Stocking Tales. But here the legend outshone the actual man. Though a skillful Indian fighter, explorer, and guide, his efforts administering Boonesboro and opening up Kentucky for the Transylvania Land Company were less than successful. In his latter years, he held a number of minor offices and died in Missouri in 1820. Still, Daniel Boone remains the quintessential frontiersman and was a hero looked up to by other legendary figures like Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie. At the end of the French and Indian War, the land later known as the Old Northwest Territory passed to Britain. The question was, who owned this land? Britain, the colonists, or the Native American tribes that occupied it? Oddly, Britain acknowledged that the land belonged to Indians. In 1763, British leaders drew a line down the backbone of the Appalachian Mountains, called the Line of Proclamation, this boundary dividing the colonies from Indian territory. However, American settlers did not respect the borderline. In 1767, George Washington stated that the proclamation line was
a temporary expedient to quiet the minds of the Indians. Anyone who neglects the present opportunity of hunting out good lands and in some measure marking and distinguishing them will never regain it.
At that time, the colonies were more than doubling their population every 25 years. To appease the colonists' desire for more land, the British moved the line further west through land purchases from the Indians. One such purchase of 1.8 million acres in present-day eastern Tennessee was acquired by the Indiana Land Company from the Iroquois Confederation. In 1772, groups of settlers moved into the area and founded the Watauga Association. It became the first American independent government outside of the 13 colonies. In 1796, Tennessee would become the 16th state. Interestingly, the territory, and later the state of Indiana, got its name from maps drawn up by the Indiana Land Company, which quietly disappeared by the year 1780. However, this massive land purchase and others set the stage for the complete settlement of the Old Northwest Territory in the Deep South by American pioneers. Along the El Camino Real in today's California can be found a series of beautiful Spanish missions, living testaments to the spirit of their founder, Father Juniper Serra. On this site in San Diego in 1769, this Spanish priest founded his first California mission. Father Serra at that time was 56 and in poor health. Yet he worked tirelessly for the next 15 years at converting Indians to Christianity and establishing 9 of the eventual 21 missions along the El Camino Real. Politically, Spain, which occupied parts of present-day Florida, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, sought to protect her holdings in the New World. The reason Spain sent Father Juniper Serra and others to build missions throughout the Southwest was to establish a buffer for her Mexican colony against Russian expansion from Alaska. California would continue to serve that purpose for the next 80 years until the gold rush of 1849, when an independent Mexico would lose California to the United States as a result of the Mexican-American War. However, the spirit of Father Serra and the Spanish mission tradition can still be felt throughout California today. Less than a month after the event depicted in this painting, Paul Revere began selling his most famous engraving. He called it the Bloody Massacre Perpetrated in King Street. It quickly became a defining moment, symbolizing British tyranny to the American people. In the years following the French and Indian War, the presence of British soldiers in the colonies became a sore point for a growing number of radical patriots. New York was hailed throughout the colonies for refusing to appropriate funds to pay for quartering royal troops. By 1770, Tensions between the soldiers and patriots had escalated severely. Led by the Sons of Liberty, troop baiting by citizens became a potent sign of colonial loathing of British presence. In New York City, patriots erected liberty poles as symbols of freedom. British soldiers tore them down. This back-and-forth dueling became a kind of reckless sport. On January 17, 1770, the game turned violent. That night, British soldiers and the Sons of Liberty clashed over a liberty pole erected near present-day Wall Street in an area called Gold Hill. Men on both sides were badly wounded, but no shots were fired. This would not be the case 2 months later. On the evening of March 5th, a crowd looking for trouble descended upon troops guarding the customs house in Boston. The citizens threw oyster shells and sticks at the nervous troops, daring them to fire. One man was heard to cry out, "We will not have you here." The scared soldiers disobeyed orders and fired unexpectedly into the crowd. By the time a British officer stopped the shooting, 5 Americans were dead. The event in Boston was quickly christened the Boston Massacre, and the American Revolution had its first martyrs. Crispus Attucks, a black man, was the first to die and became a hero. 70 years later, with the words, "The first to defy, the first to die," he became a powerful symbol for abolitionists as they demanded the end of slavery. After the Boston Massacre, the British troops were ordered to Castle Island in Boston Harbor. But the first shots of the revolution had been fired, and the patriots had a reminder of their cause in the form of Paul Revere's engraving. They met in ports across the colonies, in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston. On the agenda, what to do about the shiploads of tea soon arriving from Britain. Swiftly, the cry rose up against this British monopoly. The oddity was that tea arriving from Britain would actually be cheaper than it had been before. In an attempt to save the financially troubled British East Indian Company, Parliament waived the export tax out of Britain and continued the small import tax colonists had been paying without complaint since the Townshend Revenue Act of 1768. Britain's leaders felt that Americans would welcome the lower prices, and by all rights, they should have. In Charleston, South Carolina, the arriving tea was simply locked up until after the Revolution was over. In New York and Philadelphia, the ships never entered the harbor. But the governor of Massachusetts, understanding that British sovereignty was at stake, allowed 3 ships loaded with tea to dock in Boston. He assumed the strong British military presence would protect the ship's cargo. Abigail Adams wrote these prophetic words when the tea arrived.
The tea, that baneful weed, is arrived. Great, and I hope, effectual opposition has been made to the landing of it. The proceedings of our citizens have been united, spirited, and firm. Great will be the devastation if not timely quenched or allayed by some more lenient measures.
As hundreds watched, on the evening of December 16, 1773, 60 men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded the 3 ships and dumped 45 tons of tea overboard. John Adams, who would become the 2nd president of the United States, once opposed to mob action, now changed his mind.
This destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, and it must have so important consequences and so lasting that I cannot but consider it an epoch in history. John Adams.
What became known as the Boston Tea Party did become an epochal event of history. On hearing news of the Boston Tea Party, King George III declared, "We must master them, or totally leave them to themselves and treat them as aliens." George III's declaration set the tone for Britain's response to the Tea Party. There would be no more appeasement offered the colonies. Elected representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies met from September 5th to October 26th here at Philadelphia's Carpenter Hall. These representatives formed a Congress that would essentially govern America for the next 15 years. It was 1774, and though the delegates were not entirely clear as to the First Continental Congress's ultimate purpose, in retrospect, they inaugurated the United States of America. In response to the Boston Tea Party, the British Parliament enacted a series of provocative laws dubbed the Intolerable Acts by the colonists. This legislation punished Boston and re-established British authority over the entire colony. The last, and most inflammatory act, required that colonists quarter British troops in their homes. At the opening of the First Continental Congress, Patrick Henry, delegate from Virginia, addressed the delegates with these electrifying words.
The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American.
By the time Congress adjourned, Resolutions were passed opposing the intolerable acts, and 10 colonial rights were spelled out, including the right to life, liberty, and property. When the delegates to the Congress, such as Sam Adams, John Adams, and George Washington, left Carpenter Hall, the American colonies had acted as a single nation for the first time. While these men of vision and talent waited for the British response to their proclamations, the fight had already begun as troops from both sides moved for advantage. On Concord's North Bridge, April 19, 1775, a shot was fired. Often referred to as the shot heard around the world, it changed the course of history in North America forever. Just before midnight on the 18th, British troops under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith had been ordered to move out of Boston and seize military stores at Concord and detain the rebel leaders Sam Adams and John Hancock. However, by the time the troops were underway, Paul Revere and William Dawes had already spotted 2 lanterns hanging in the belfry of the Old North Church. The Patriots' code for the British raid had been 1 if by land and 2 if by sea. Both men immediately set out to warn citizens along the Charles River from Boston to Concord with the alarm. "The British are coming! The British are coming!" By morning, 70 American Minutemen answered the call and gathered at Lexington to meet the invaders. Greatly outnumbered, the Americans were quickly routed. 10 colonists were killed and 9 wounded. So began the first battle of the American Revolutionary War, a battle Colonel Smith would quickly discover that was far from over. Hours later, a larger, better prepared American force met the British at the North Bridge, outside of Concord. This time the outcome was vastly different.
The country was full of hills, woods, stone walls, etc., which the rebels did not fail to take advantage of, for they were all lined up with people who kept an incessant fire upon us as we did upon them, but not with the same advantage, for they were so concealed that there was hardly any seeing them.
Fighting Indian style, the American militia pursued the British back to Boston. By the time the fighting ended, 273 British troops and 95 Americans had died. After the battle, a British officer observed,
Whoever looks upon them as an irregular mob will find himself mistaken.
Reports of the Battle of Lexington and Concord raced through the colonies, and the continent prepared once more for total war. After the battles at Lexington and Concord, 2 events moved the Revolution swiftly forward. Militia from other New England colonies poured into Massachusetts and surrounded Boston, trapping the British Army there. And delegates from the colonies met in a Second Continental Congress at Philadelphia. The Congress now had to form a government and conduct a war. The siege of Boston precipitated the Battle of Bunker Hill, the first large-scale action with colonial soldiers fighting British regulars. American forces were woefully undersupplied, and lines of command were muddled, causing great chaos.
Dear Mr. Samuel Adams, to be plain, it appears to me there was never more confusion and less command.
The British assaulted the American lines. American commanders, knowing they had to hoard their powder and shot, ordered their men to be patient.
Hold your fire, men, until you see the whites of their eyes.
Twice the British regulars were repulsed with heavy losses. On the 3rd try, they breached the American defenses largely because the militias had run out of ammunition and discipline had broken down. Oddly, the lack of military discipline and training did allow the Americans some measure of victory. Improvisation and novel solutions gave the Yankees an ability to fight and then run away to fight another day. But the Battle of Bunker Hill demonstrated the urgency of a trained army to the new government. Congress immediately issued paper money to pay the troops, appointed delegates to negotiate with foreign countries for military aid, and sought a commander-in-chief of a continental army. They chose George Washington. Made a colonel after his own heroics in the Battle of Wilderness in 1755, Washington was the colony's only true military leader. Washington's passive engagement in Virginia politics, his own balanced personality, and the loyalty and admiration of those men whom he commanded in the French and Indian War made him the logical choice to lead America's army. Washington quickly took command of the militias in Massachusetts and began training them into an effective fighting force. His appointment as commander-in-chief proved to be the most important decision in America's Revolution. He wasn't even an American. In 1774, Benjamin Franklin sponsored his immigration to the colonies at the age of 37. Yet he was the first to use the phrase, the United States of America. After the war, he returned to his homeland, England. Yet at a critical moment in the American Revolution, he expressed to the colonists in simple terms what the intellectual concept of inalienable rights for all people meant. He was the author of the best-selling pamphlet Common Sense, published in 1776. He was Thomas Paine. Written for the common man in plain English, Paine's Common Sense sold over 500,000 copies. In it, Paine laid out the argument for a complete break with Britain and with the monarchy.
Europe is too thickly planted with kingdoms to be long at peace. And whenever a war breaks out between England and any foreign power, the trade of America goes to ruin because of her connections with Britain. Thomas Paine.
Paine's words define the essence of the American cause and the need for ordinary Americans to take up arms.
Did the British kill a parent or child and leave you a ruined and wretched survivor? If they did, and you can still shake hands with the murderers, then whatever may be your rank or title in life, you have the heart of a coward and the spirit of a sycophant. Thomas Paine.
In Philadelphia, while Adams and Jefferson and others were writing what would become the Declaration of Independence, Common Sense jump-started the colonists' need to act for independence.
Common Sense contained a tolerable summary of the arguments which I had been repeating again and again in Congress for 9 months. John Adams.
In the years following the American victory, Paine produced an impressive body of political philosophy. Eventually, he returned to Europe, where he attempted to foment revolutions in Britain and France. He died in poverty and obscurity back in the United States in 1809. But in every revolution, there is one person whose words defined the cause. Thomas Paine was that man at that time for the American Revolution. Today, it is celebrated with great fanfare every July 4th. It is Independence Day for nearly 300 million Americans. However, unlike most revolutions, America's Independence Day celebrates not a bloody battle or the overthrow of a malevolent dictator or monarch. The American Independence Day celebrates an intellectual document, the Declaration of Independence. This document was the defining moment of American political thought and philosophy that American colonists had been striving toward since the French and Indian War. By the spring of 1776, opposition to American independence centered in the middle colonies of Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. However, by mid-May, those who still argued for allegiance to the king lost their influence.
Our petitions have not been heard, yet answered with fleets and armies. Sam Adams.
By the time the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia State House that June, the only question concerning independence left before the representatives was the timing. Should they wait for a groundswell from the people? Thomas Jefferson argued that Congress should act immediately.
The people wait for us to lead the way.
The representatives agreed that Congress should wait 3 weeks while delegates from the mid-Atlantic colonies shored up support for independence. Meanwhile, Congress appointed a committee led by Thomas Jefferson to write the document. The other members were Robert Livingston from New York, Roger Sherman from Connecticut, Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, and John Adams from Massachusetts. By July 1st, they had a document that began with soaring phrases now taught to every American student. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. On July 1st, the committee presented the document to Congress. Representatives debated it for 4 days. Little was changed except that a long passage which blamed Negro slavery on the king was eliminated. On July 4th, the Declaration of Independence passed with no negative votes recorded against it. The 13 colonies unanimously declared themselves independent of Great Britain. The celebration began as it was read to a throng of people outside of the State House. Great celebrations of joy followed throughout the colonies, but the war had still to be won. It was a dark, wintry night, and it is perhaps the best-known image of the Revolutionary War, George Washington crossing the Delaware River. After triumphs at Concord, Ticonderoga, and Bunker Hill, the colonies were now experiencing mostly retreat and defeat. By the end of 1776, reversals were everywhere. The British successfully evacuated Boston. Under General John Burgoyne, they retook Montreal, maintaining their hold on Canada. A British force under the Howe brothers landed in New York and easily drove Washington's ill-trained army from New York City. The result was American forces lost thousands of men and tons of much-needed supplies. The British now controlled the lower Hudson and were poised to move northward from New York and southward from Canada to cut off New England, the center of the Revolution, from the rest of the colonies. In this bleak hour, Washington was forlorn and wrote on December 18th,
I am wearied to death. I think the game is pretty near up.
With the isolation of New England seeming all but finished, two great moments in history came to pass. Thomas Paine wrote the first of his famous letters on the American crisis. These letters appeared in newspapers throughout the colonies.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Thomas Paine.
Meanwhile, George Washington conceived a series of bold strokes to revive the spirits of all Americans. Wintering in Morrisville, Pennsylvania, Washington divided his army in three forces. The three groups would cross the Delaware River and converge on Hessian mercenaries at Bordentown in Trenton, New Jersey. Washington's force was the only one to make the crossing. They caught the German soldiers off guard, and after a 45-minute battle, they captured Trenton. Washington's army returned across the river with 900 prisoners. Washington's second move was to recross the Delaware 4 days later to capture British supplies. To his chagrin, he was met by a force of 6,000 under the command of Lord Charles Cornwallis. As night fell, the sly fox Washington escaped behind a screen of burning campfires while the British slept. Washington then seized Princeton and its supplies, forcing Cornwallis to move back to Brunswick, New Jersey. At the end of the day, Washington kept them from taking Philadelphia. More importantly, he had re-energized the American cause when, at the lowest moment in the war, a moment of defeat and possible surrender, he had turned the tide and set the politicians and soldiers back on the road to victory. It's called Old Glory, the Stars and Stripes. It's the official flag of the United States, and it had its beginning with an act of the Continental Congress, June 14, 1777.
Resolved that the flag of the 13 United States be 13 stripes, alternate red and white, that the Union be 13 stars, which in a blue field, representing a new constellation.
As legend would have it, the first American flag was purportedly made by the Philadelphia seamstress Betsy Ross. Betsy would often tell her relatives and friends of the fateful day when 3 members of a secret committee from the Continental Congress called upon her. Those representatives, George Washington, Robert Morris, and George Ross, spoke with her about sewing a flag for the new nation. According to Betsy, General Washington showed her a rough design of the flag that included a 6-pointed star. Betsy quickly produced a 5-pointed star, and so impressed the committee that they entrusted her with making the first flag. That flag had 13 stars and 13 stripes. Later, when Kentucky and Tennessee joined the Union, 2 additional stripes were added along with the 2 new stars. This was the flag that Francis Scott Key saw flying over Fort McHenry during the War of 1812, and it inspired him to write the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. Later, as new stars were added, the stripes were once again reduced to 13. Old Glory flies at all federal buildings and lands, and is the most powerful emotional symbol of freedom for Americans today. Near Saratoga in upstate New York, on September 19, 1777, a British Royal Army under the command of General John Burgoyne marched southward on forested roads along the Hudson River. A grand strategy conceived the winter before directed Burgoyne to move downriver and meet up with General Clinton's army from New York City. Britain hoped that by isolating New England from the rest of America, they would crush American resistance and bring a quick end to the war. However, on that late summer day, an American army under the command of Horatio Gates brought Burgoyne's royal troops to a standstill. For the next 3 weeks, Burgoyne waited vainly for Clinton's reinforcements, while more American soldiers arrived at Gates' encampment. 3 weeks later, the British faced over 17,000 American army and militia, and on October 7th, a second battle began in a clearing outside of Saratoga. By nightfall, the British had suffered over 1,000 casualties. The next morning, Burgoyne's forces retreated northward. On October 17th, with his men exhausted and surrounded, General Burgoyne surrendered. The Americans had just won the most decisive battle of the Revolutionary War. Vanquished was a British army of 5,000 troops, and all their munitions and equipment fell into American hands. This single American victory stunned Britain and heralded her eventual defeat. When news of the American victory reached Europe, France openly became an ally to the American cause. In the winter of 1777 and 78, America's minister to France, Benjamin Franklin, negotiated 2 treaties between France and the United States. In the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, France not only recognized American independence, but the new nation's right to trade with whom it wanted. At the same time, the Treaty of Alliance brought France into the war. The treaty's stated purpose was to assure the liberty, sovereignty, and independence absolute and unlimited of the United States. The change in fortunes was astonishing. A year earlier, America's government was in disarray, its army in retreat, and its cause teetering on the brink of failure. With the victory at Saratoga, the tide of battle in the Revolutionary War turned. American resistance firmed, the morale of her army soared. New England was safe, and France committed her navy and troops to the cause of U.S. independence. Still, the war was far from finished. A powerful British army occupied Philadelphia, and ahead lay 2 major phases of the Revolutionary War, Valley Forge and the battle for the Mid-Atlantic states and the Southern Campaign. Today, America's naval power stands second to none. The ships and the men and the women of this mighty force can trace their origins back to the Revolutionary War and the influence of its most acclaimed naval hero, John Paul Jones. Jones's determination essentially founded the U.S. Navy, and he sustained its life during the Revolutionary War through the force of his indomitable will against vastly superior British forces. Jones went to sea at the tender age of 13 and came to America 13 years later in 1773, already a seasoned captain. 4 years after his arrival, he was given command of the Ranger. At the same time, Congress authorized the Stars and Stripes as the U.S. flag, and Jones was the first to hoist the flag on an American warship. In November 1777, Jones sailed for France, carrying word of the British surrender at Saratoga. Once there, he received from France the first salute recognizing the Stars and Stripes and the United States as an independent nation. For the next 2 years, Jones and the Ranger pillaged the British coast, at one point capturing the British sloop of war, the Drake. In 1779, Jones proclaimed his most famous words while commanding the Bonhomme Richard against the British ship Serapis. Severely outgunned, he quickly found himself in desperate straits. Asked to strike his colors, he answered with his immortal phrase, "I have not yet begun to fight." An hour later, the Serapis surrendered. With this one battle, Jones set the standard for American naval valor for centuries to come. The Navy he founded grew slowly in importance. From the Revolutionary War to the Mexican-American War, its small size dictated a strategy of commercial raiding and single-ship engagements which produced stunning victories. During the Civil War, the United States began to develop a larger fleet, and the North, with its numerical superiority, was able to blockade southern ports. Over the next 30 years, Alfred T. Mahan argued for a new American Navy composed of steel-hulled, steam-driven ships. A true fleet that has continued to grow into the 20th century until no other nation on the planet possesses a Navy that can assemble fleets on every ocean. The United States naval superiority can be traced back to the traditions of valor in honor of John Paul Jones during the American Revolutionary War. The winter of 1777 and 78 at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, was the dark night of the soul for George Washington and the Continental Army. Encamped at an old ironworks a few miles from British-occupied Philadelphia, Washington and his men suffered through a winter of hell in these makeshift log cabins. Washington wrote from Valley Forge,
"To see the men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lie upon,
without shoes, without a house or hut to cover them until those could be built, and submitting without a murmur, as a proof of patience and obedience which, in my opinion, can scarcely be paralleled.
Earlier in 1777, while Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates defeated and captured a 5,000-man British army at Saratoga, New York, a much larger contingent of British troops commanded by General Howe chased General Washington and his force around Pennsylvania. As winter set in, Howe and his army retired to Philadelphia, where they encamped comfortably until spring. Washington moved his troops to Inclement Valley Forge, close enough to keep an eye on the British. It was during this winter that Washington, with the help of the Prussian military expert Frederick von Steuben, welded these tattered forces into a disciplined corps of American soldiers, a formidable army that would settle the question once and for all of whether there was to be an American nation. Valley Forge also added immensely to General Washington's stature and the stature of the American cause. So when the news of the French and American alliance reached the American shores, the British, fearing a blockade of the Delaware Bay by the French fleet, decided to move the troops north to New York. In response, Washington immediately left Valley Forge, and a Battle of Monmouth, New Jersey ensued. It was a battle that saw the American Continental Army fight the seasoned British troops to a standstill. One of the heroes of Monmouth was Mary Ludwig Hayes, a nurse at Valley Forge. On the bullet-swept battlefield of Monmouth in the summer of 1778, Mary earned her nickname, Molly Pitcher, while carrying pitchers of water to wounded men and for cooling down the artillery pieces. During the course of the battle, her husband fell wounded. Molly took his place, and the battery continued to fire. For her heroic role, General Washington gave her a battlefield rank of sergeant. After the Battle of Monmouth, the Revolutionary War was about to enter the endgame, a game that would now shift to the South, as Howe's successor, General Clinton, was about to move a part of his army from New York to South Carolina. Valley Forge was the turning point for the American Army and the nation. In the 21st century, the men and women of America's armed forces carry on the traditions first begun at Valley Forge and are the best trained army in the world. Native American chiefs called him the first man living, the great invincible long knife. Born in Virginia in 1752, by the age of 20, he was already a skilled frontiersman surveying land in Kentucky. 5 years later, he sat at this table, developing a strategy that, next to independence itself, would be the greatest prize of the American Revolution. He was a man whose myths paled in comparison to real-life deeds. He was George Rogers Clark, a true American hero. When the Revolutionary War broke out, Britain controlled the Ohio River Valley and the upper Great Lakes region through forts originally established by the French in the early part of the 18th century. From these forts, they used their Indian allies to attack American settlers in Kentucky, in hopes of opening a Western front against the Americans and tipping the war in favor of Britain. Virginia Governor Patrick Henry entrusted George Rogers Clark, then just 25 years old, with the defense of American settlers along this frontier, the Northwest Territory. Clark was over 6 feet tall and ruggedly built, fiery and daring. His warrior feats inspired fear and respect in his Indian enemies. His personal rapport with his men filled them with an eagerness for battle and inspired them to heroic deeds. Clark's plan was simple and direct. Take and hold the old French forts the British used to supply their Indian allies. In June 1778, Clark and 175 men left for a raid on Kaskaskia in present-day Illinois. On July 4th, they took the fort by surprise without firing a single shot. Clark offered the French inhabitants all the privileges of American citizenship in return for their oath of allegiance. This and the news of the recent Franco-American alliance won their support. Swiftly, other French forts accepted Clark's terms, including nearby Cahokia and Vincennes in Indiana. At the same time, Clark made peace with many of the Indian tribes in the surrounding territory. However, when news of Clark's actions reached British leaders, they sent a force from Detroit under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hamilton to retake Vincennes. Clark immediately realized that with the loss of this strategic fort, the British could once again control the region. In the dead of winter, he wrote Patrick Henry,
"If I fail, this country and also Kentucky is lost."
On February 25th, after a 240-mile march over rough, wintry terrain, Clark and 207 volunteers recaptured Vincennes by fooling the British commander into believing he faced a vastly superior force of 600. From that date, Clark broke the power of the British in the West and made it possible for America to claim all of the Northwest Territory at the end of the war. The new government of the United States never reimbursed or properly thanked Clark for his heroic efforts and sacrifices. However, like the true American hero, he continued to serve his country, advising Jefferson throughout his life. His younger brother, William Clark, led the Lewis and Clark expedition into the newly acquired Louisiana Territory in 1804. George Rogers Clark was the archetypal American hero. At his funeral in 1818, John Rowan said,
"The mighty oak of the forest has fallen, and now the scrub oaks may sprout all around. The father of the western country is no more."
By 1778, the war had proved unwinnable for Britain in the north. The number of patriots vastly outnumbered loyalists, and the Continental Army was equal to anything Britain could place on the field. Believing they would find more loyalists among the aristocratic southern plantation owners, British leaders shifted the war south to Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Washington's home state of Virginia. At first, the southern campaign went badly for the Americans. In 1778, the British had captured Savannah. Charleston fell in 1780. Soon after, British forces under General Cornwallis worked their way through North Carolina and into Virginia. But a series of lightning-quick victories for the Americans turned the tide of war. At Kings Mountain in North Carolina, a Tar Heel militia destroyed a British force. At this place, known as Cowpens, Daniel Morgan's troops decimated a British army of 1,000, killing and wounding 900. General Cornwallis called this defeat a very unexpected and severe blow. Then at Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis's army was mauled severely by colonial troops. He was forced to retreat toward the Virginia coast, where in an unexpected twist of fate, Britain and the new United States would settle the Revolutionary War not far from the site of Britain's first colony, founded 174 years earlier. The big battle should have taken place in New York, but Washington had fooled General Clinton and took his army south. While General Cornwallis and his men dug in at Yorktown, the French landed 3,000 troops near Williamsburg and waited for Washington's arrival. The siege of Yorktown began in September 1781. The French fleet blockaded the coast, and 17,000 American and French troops surrounded the British position on land. On October 17, 1781, General Cornwallis surrendered unconditionally to Washington. The war was over. Celebrations rang out through the colonies, and the British were in shock. On hearing the news of Cornwallis's defeat, Britain's Prime Minister Lord North exclaimed, "Oh my God, it is all over!" America won largely because of the alliance with France, the ineptitude of Britain's leaders, and the Continental Congress's good sense in hiring George Washington to lead its army. But Britain also lost the war because the war was not only a revolution for independence, but also a revolution in war itself. By 1780, Britain had occupied America's four major cities: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, which in a conventional European conflict would have signaled victory. However, America's cities were not the center of the country's strength, for the center of America was everywhere. Each American man and woman were themselves the nation. The American forces were not fighting for a distant monarch, but for themselves. This unusual sketch shows the American negotiators Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, John Jay, and Henry Lawrence at the 1783 Treaty of Paris, signing the document that ended the Revolutionary War. Missing from the sketch are the British negotiators, who refused to sit for the painting. This work of art is a perfect symbol of the gulf that separated Britain and its former colonies. After 8 years of war, America had cast off the chains of British rule, but she gained much more than her independence. The nation received all lands west of the Mississippi River and south of the Great Lakes to Florida. The treaty also allowed the United States unfettered navigation of the Mississippi River and fishing rights off of Newfoundland. 100,000 loyalists were promised compensation and allowed to move to Canada or Britain. America was now ready to begin the grand experiment in self-government and the unbridled expansion to the west, which would result in the admittance of 2 new states into the Union before the end of the century. The Treaty of Paris gave to the new country everything it needed to launch itself upon the world's stage: commerce and land. With these 2 elements, this new nation would supplant England and France as the world's superpower in a mere 175 years.